Hi everybody, Terrible Dactyl here and welcome back to Jurassic Plastic. I'm here with the entire Carnegie Collection Prehistoric Mammals line. Yes, you heard me right. Every single prehistoric mammal that the Carnegie Collection by Safari ever produced during its long run from 1988 to 2015. We got, count 'em, 1, 2, 3, 4 models. Yes. Yeah, Safari has gotten a lot better with the whole doing prehistoric mammals thing. Since the end of the Carnegie line, they've come out with some really amazing mammal figures. Some of my favorites of Safari's actually are the mammal figures that have been coming out the past couple of years. They're really ridiculously good in my opinion, most of them. The Carnegie ones I also really like. I just wish there were a lot more of them. I'm not going to focus on the whole line today, though, because I had a request way back when I first started doing these videos to review the Carnegie Collection Smilodon. So let's take a look at that one. We're going to get these guys out of the way real quick and just take a look at Smilodon here. Now, Smilodon, in my opinion, is one of the best early Carnegie Collection models. Just taking a quick little walk around of it here, you can see for a relatively plain colored cat figure, they really went out of their way to make it look like a little sculpture, the kind of sculpture you might see on display near the bones of this animal in a museum. And not only a little sculpture, I think the clear inspiration for this model is a very well-known painting of Smilodon by Charles R. Knight. And the first thing I want to point out on my example here, which I believe, based on my research, is either the original version of Smilodon or one of the very early ones that came out in the 80s, is this green wash. Usually I would not be so fond of something like that. Can you see this? Look, it's got a green wash. Almost like that mossy green where turn it just right and that green color on the sides and the back, a little bit on the back of the head, it really comes out. And I thought that was a really interesting choice because to me, that's the kind of thing, you would obviously not see green coloration on the real life animal. So what were they going for here? Well, where you would utilize a green wash like that is if you're trying to go for a very specific lighting effect in a painting. And the thing I love right off the bat about the Carnegie Smilodon is it really looks like a three-dimensional model of a painting. Thanks, I think, in large part to that green wash. The blending on this is really nice, really subtle. It really complements the very finely sculpted details here. So let's get into the sculpt real quick. It is a little bit blocky, which is characteristic of early Carnegie models. Now this model probably was released in 1989. The date stamp on the bottom, the info stamp here, you can see actually reads 1988, like all of the first 17 Carnegie models. However, it seems to me that these were not part of one wave, if you will, that everything after number 9 probably was not actually released until the following year, 1989. And by that time, they'd actually switched the production materials. If you look at some of the original Carnegie collections that did come out in 1989, like my Australopithecus here, they're all made of this very rubbery, beige-ish, in a lot of cases, plastic, or maybe I should just say rubber. very, very soft, very flexible. Not a lot of different colors painted on top. Once you get to the 1989 models, for example, Smilodon, some of the early examples of Maiasaura, Dimetrodon, Protoceratops, other than the ones that have really thin parts, like the Pteranodon and the Diplodocus, they're made of really hard plastic. And if you actually look at some of the missing paint areas here, I'll try to focus in on one on the foot, you can see that across the board, they're all made of this really, really dark gray, almost black, hard plastic that feels like the texture of PVC pipe. Right, that is obviously a much different plastic than this. This is much more rubbery, much more flexible. This feels like there is no possible way I could ever get this thing to bend even a little bit. No matter how hard I squeeze its paws together, I think it would snap before it bent. That's the kind of plastic we're talking about. And they did reissue the 1988 models in this type of plastic, at least most of them from what I've been able to tell. So right away, this is kind of a second year of release model. But there was no 1988, rubbery release Smilodon that I know of. Now, that hypothesis could be wrong, so please let me know if you have a really rubbery Smilodon. I'm not actually sure what the later versions of this were made of, so it could also be a later one. The later ones dropped the green wash. They had a much darker brown paint job, and you will notice on the later ones that the paint applications, especially around the face, are a lot sloppier. So some people prefer the later Smilodons just because of the more in-person realistic color. I personally really like this one in terms of the green wash. People will say that's not very realistic, and clearly it's not, but as an artistic flourish on this, that kind of makes me like it a lot better. The artistry of these is kind of the reason I really like the old Carnegies, clearly not so much the scientific accuracy angle. So let's go head to toe here. You can see that even on my early sample, the teeth are a little sloppily painted. They've got this cream-colored paint that is only applied to the front of the tooth. If you look at the side and the back, they're not painted all around. And the eyes, nose, and whiskers are a little bit crudely painted, just little black dots. Little very fine black line for the eyebrow, and you've got a little dab of red that they somehow reached in there with a paintbrush, probably from the side, and got on the inside of the mouth. It's got a little bit of a white beard here around the chin, and you can see that the white paint was applied thicker in some places than in others. It looks like it may even have maybe a slightly airbrushed wash over an initial white paint application on the mutton chops here, and the white goes a little bit onto the neck, but not too much. Very, very slightly onto the inside of the arms, and then obviously we see that white paint again on the fingers, on the paws. Other than that, most of the body is a uniform paint application. So as I said before, it's got this dark gray hard plastic that is completely painted over with a very light yellowish brown, and then washed over with this green, and then once again we've got white highlights on the tail. I really like the way that the ears are sculpted. Once again, very painting-like, very subtle, how they're not really that well defined from certain angles. But once you get some shading on this, maybe in your display somewhere, it really gives it a certain attitude. It's almost like an impressionist figure rather than a very realist type of figure with those ears. You can see some nice detail along the creases in the top of the ear here. Once again, they're not quite as well defined going to the back of the head, but you do have a little bit of sculpting towards the edge of the ear to indicate a little bit of furriness there. And the fur sculpt over the entire model, you're going to notice, is very, very subtle. Just a few lines of fur here and there, along with some skin and body texturing to indicate the underneath anatomy of a close, a short pelt. Like these little indication of ribs here on the side, the shoulder blade kind of poking out a little bit here towards the top, some of the musculature underneath the arms, especially on the one that's reaching forward, and over here on this side you've got the same rib texturing, and that rib texturing is really just achieved by little slight subtle indentations with the fur texture only in between the indentation. Once again, this is very characteristic of Forrest Rogers' early style, where she kind of went minimalist with kind of just implying skin texture with various kind of wrinkles on the leathery skin of the dinosaurs. Not quite scale patterns, but something that can kind of suggest either a scale pattern or a wrinkling. Really nicely done. The paws are a little bit ill-defined on the bottom, but there is an attempt to give it some pads. It almost would have been nice if they used another shade of paint to kind of color some of these pads gray. But you can see it's a nice touch that they are actually sculpted. Now they are only sculpted on the raised hand that's swiping here. On the other paws, there's no pad sculpting on the bottom at all. Once again, we have a little bit of fur texture along the belly, at least the sides of the belly, and more along the back, and obviously on the tail. The pose of this model, like I said earlier, is very reminiscent of the pose of that famous Charles R. Knight painting. It's not identical, and the coloration is also not identical, but I think that's a pretty clear inspiration. I really like the pose on this model. I think it's dynamic. It allows for a really nice display piece, and overall the color pattern, as you can see, aside from that green wash, is very plain. Something to be said for the newer Safari Smilodon is that they gave it some little spotting and striping on there, which current scientific studies would suggest is probably more accurate, because it seems like Smilodon probably lived in more forested areas, and so it may have had coloration more typical of a forest cat rather than more of an open area plains cat like this has been given. But for a very traditional depiction of Smilodon, you can't really get more traditional than this, which is one of the reasons I like it. It's got very, very good realism. Aside from scientific accuracy, it looks like a very believable animal, with those little slight creases of skin texture, especially around here, thick neck muscles as it's lunging forward. Even the striations on the face kind of imply activity. It's a really beautiful model, and it's one of my favorites from the entire Carnegie line. I actually didn't get this model until this year. I remember seeing Smilodons pretty much all over the place when I was a kid, going into stores that would sell Carnegie Collection, like the World of Science, and they kind of sat around. I don't remember Smilodon being that big a seller. It kind of goes along in a set with the Australopithecus, which also, in my experience, were not big sellers. I think my store had the same pair of Australopithecus sitting out for sale for many, many years before it shut down, even well after their retirement in around 1995 or 1996. And, I guess maybe that's part of the reason why Safari shied away from doing more mammals. What I can't quite figure out is why they shied away from this scale. These three models are the only Safari models that are done in 1/15th scale. Now, as I said in my Australopithecus video, these, if you actually do the measurements, could kind of be more 1/12th scale, which is fine. This could also be 1/12th if it was maybe a slightly smaller individual of Smilodon. But there really are not any other Carnegie models that have been made between 1/10 and 1/20th scale. We got a lot of 1/10s, we got a lot of 1/20s, no other 1/15s. And when they came out with the next larger scale model, which was the Psittacosaurus in 1999, that was a 1/10. I'm not sure why they didn't just go a little smaller with that one so that it could fit in with the existing scale and really just have 2 or 3 scales in the Carnegie line. You can understand why they didn't do that with the Mammoth. This is a 130 or 135 scale Mammoth, and clearly if you went 1/15 with this thing, it would be pretty enormous. So that's understandable. But it does make a little kind of a nice sub-collection. All 3 of these models are not super easy to come by today, but especially the Smilodon, I've noticed that for whatever reason, goes for ridiculous prices on eBay. I don't know what is going on with the Smilodon model or why people think it commands such high prices. It doesn't seem to be particularly rare. As of right now, I think there's like 5 or 6 of them available on eBay, and it's the same 5 or 6 that have been available for months now, and nobody is buying them because they're each somewhere between $50 and even up to $200. Not even for the original one, but for the newer one with sloppier paint applications and I guess what some people would call a more realistic body coloration that's closer to this brown on the Australopithecus male here. But I don't think they're that rare. I don't think they're $200 rare. If you wait for a good deal, I guess you can get one. Maybe I just got lucky with this. I got this for less than $20 on eBay earlier this year. And this is the original. It didn't even come with a tag or anything. I have seen a couple Smilodons on eBay that still come with the original tag, which is kind of cool, but I don't think it would necessarily, for me, increase the price that much. So if this is something that's missing from your collection, especially if you're interested in prehistoric mammals, I would say it's definitely worth getting, but also definitely worth waiting for a fair price. Just to kind of show you the scale here compared to some of Safari's newer mammals, this is the Safari Macrochania, which you may want to display with the Smilodon thanks to things like Walking with Beasts that feature them together. This would be a little bit too small. Obviously, this is closer to a 130 scale model. But once again, if this were a smaller individual, like maybe it's going after a juvenile Macrochania, I think they work very well together. Just to give you a further sense of scale, as is now the tradition, I have to bring out my Marx Caveman. There it is. And if you wanted to do some kind of crazy, 1960s cheap B-movie dinosaur thing with an enormous Smilodon devouring caveman, go find one of those Marx ones, because this guy is definitely a 140 figure and does not fit in with any of those. But it's tradition, so I had to bring him out. Well, there you have it. The Carnegie Collection Smilodon. One of my favorite Carnegie Collection models. It has a place of pride up there on my Carnegie Mountain, and I strongly recommend this model in either color scheme to any collector who likes vintage safari stuff or even just safari mammals. Because honestly, even though it's got some accuracy issues, I think this is a beautiful figure. I think it stacks up really well against the newer Carnegie Smilodon, even though that one is a more accurate coloration and fits in the scale with the other safari mammals better. This is just one of the best models that I think has ever been done of this species. So it's worth looking for. Thank you guys, and if you enjoyed that video, please make sure to hit like, hit subscribe, comment in the comments, whatever you want to say. And until next time, this is Terrible Dactyl. Stay tuned for more Jurassic Plastic.